Okay, so in the last post, we talked about bad designs. We talked about how they can be annoying from a usage standpoint, but also how they can cost companies. Um, so we know that there are certainly financial costs associated with poor designs, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that there are some designs, poor designs, that can cost lives. So I'll just reference you back to some of the many examples that we covered in the human factors class previously to refresh your memory on that. So, is there a solution for this? Well, when it comes to designing tools and products and systems for human usage, there is an approach called user-centered design. So you may have heard of this before, and it comes in different forms, including user experience. We call that UX, and we talk about that when we apply it to designing for a customer's experience. We may call it usability design, and we call it usability design when we're focusing on designing web pages and apps and such. And many simply reference the use of human factors when referring to a more traditionally safety-related field like aviation or healthcare. The user-centered design approach is really just a way of making sure that the user's voice is heard throughout the process and shows up in the end product. So in the post on Canvas, I highlighted a commonly accepted user-centered product development process. And this is just a series of steps where where the designer first takes time to understand where and how the product will be used, and then he develops a set of user requirements or product requirements to which the design must adhere. And then in the third step, he develops a solution, and then last he evaluates how well this design met the requirements. So it's an iterative process where the designs are created and then tested and then refined. And also key to this process is the idea that the user is represented throughout each step. So to do this, the design team often goes to the field and observes the user much like an anthropologist would. Sometimes the design team will talk to the users through one-on-one interviews or focus groups, and we can also collect qualitative data through questionnaires and surveys, and we can use a variety of other techniques like task analysis and scenario development and even something called personas, if you've ever heard of those. The user-centered design approach is ultimately going to produce a better product than one that just doesn't consider the user. So from a financial standpoint, this translates into both cost savings and revenue generation. And from a life safety standpoint, this means that the products and tools developed under this process will elicit less errors from their users, resulting in lower injuries, mistakes, and even death. I wanted to bring up a statistic. The consulting company Human Factors International reported that 15% of all IT projects are actually abandoned, and at least 50% of the programmers' time who are working on these projects is spent doing rework that's really avoidable. So following a user-centered design best practices can help to identify challenges up front in a project so that the problems and the solutions to these problems can be identified early on. So there are a number of papers and studies available that speak to the ROI of user-centered design, and if this is of interest, please let me know and I can post some of the references that I have available. Essentially, by focusing on the user at the front end of the design process, user-centered design can help us to identify gaps in our project scope and the product requirements early on. And so this gets us to a better product faster and really helps us avoid rework. So the question is, why doesn't everyone use user-centered design? And why am I just hearing about this now? Well, there are a lot of reasons for this, and it's not always a straightforward answer, but I can share with you some of my experience. Often, in my experience, many companies will look at user-centered design as a method adopted by tech companies in Silicon Valley, and they only recognize it as a tool to be used in website or app design. It sometimes seems loose and artsy, and maybe companies sometimes have difficulty applying these concepts to their own industry. Employers have told me that they don't need to talk to the customer on the front end, that they've been in the industry for decades and they know what the customer wants. And I've heard responses like, we don't want to waste our customers' time with these non-essential questions and studies. Understanding what the customer wants is really the job of our sales team. That's their perspective. And even in some cases, there's this hesitancy to present yourself to the customer in a position of perceived weakness, and really to reveal that you don't have the answer that the customer needs. So the reality is, though, spending time with users and with customers is an investment. When companies don't understand the ROI, however, they see this investment as too great a risk and don't want to proceed with it. Tim Brown also talks about this issue when he discusses how the constraints of desirability, viability, and feasibility sometimes direct product development, if you remember from this section. He argues that sometimes companies who only focus on one constraint can miss the mark. For example, he talked about companies who focus on what will fit within their framework of the existing business model. And this type of approach doesn't always produce a user-centered design that is desirable necessarily. Rather, it only puts out these products that are only incrementally better than the previous ones. So, in addition to having a hesitancy towards studying user needs, companies can also just select to adopt a specific business strategy that focuses on a single constraint rather than the balance of all three. So in the class discussion board, I'd like you to consider this issue. Think about why your company or your clients have not yet adopted a user-centered design approach. Discuss with us how this approach can impact risk either from a financial or from a life safety perspective. And also start to think about where user-centered design can be applied. Think about who can use this approach. Is it just the Silicon Valley crowd, or is this something that we can use? And think about if you have to have a background in human factors or usability to do this type of work. What would the optimal design team look like? Anyway, we'll start to touch on some of these questions in the coming sections. And with that, I will close, and I will see you in the next lecture.